Fossils. You can't live with them and you can't prove anything without them, right? Well, that last part isn't entirely true. You can prove quite a bit without them, at least when it comes to evolution. Living creatures reveal a lot when it comes to the evolution of species, but fossils can certainly help, especially when it comes to tracing the history of a species. Now, let's say you have 5 different fossils, all showing somewhat similar traits with slight differences. You can probably tell by observing these differences as well as their similarities the order to put these fossils in. You can determine which one came first and which one represents a more, say, recent specimen. But wouldn't it be nice to be able to say for sure, no matter how well preserved the fossil is, you'll never find a date on it? It's not going to say made in China 2 billion years ago. So all we can do is guess, right? Well, not quite. We can do a lot better than guess. And that's what today's show is about. All you need is a few petrified trees, throw in some decaying atoms, and you're good to go.
There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
Imagine you're climbing a mountain. You're at an elevation you haven't reached before, so the territory isn't quite familiar to you. There's snow and ice around you. It's nothing dangerous, it's just different. So you explore a little. In the distance, you spot an object. You can't quite make out what it is you are looking at, but it appears to be man-made. So you approach. As you get closer, the lines of the object begin to take shape, and after a moment, you realize what you're looking at. It's an old wooden hut. Ancient, in fact, and you can tell it's old, but you have no idea how old. So you look inside, and there's nothing there. No sign of who might have built it or when. It's also obvious to you that whomever built the hut isn't coming back, ever. They're long gone. The hut appears constructed well, using small trees to support the walls, and then it hits you. There is a way to date this hut. Your brother just happens to be a dendrochronologist. So you call him. Hey, so I found this old hut. It kind of looks ancient. You should come check it out. You might be asking, what exactly is a dendrochronologist? Well, dendrochronology is the study of tree rings. More specifically, dating tree rings or dating trees by their rings. It's exciting stuff, huh? Tree ring dating? But it's actually pretty cool stuff. A dendrochronologist, if given a decent sample of wood, can tell you approximately what year the sample came from, going back as far as 11,000 years, give or take a few hundred. Tree rings tell a story. And depending on the climate a tree is exposed to in a particular year, its rings will form to reflect that climate. These are called seasonal stamps. And the cool thing to remember here is that each ring represents a year. Dendrochronologists have studied tree rings to the extent that they can look at a seasonal stamp or a series of rings and match them to, or match it with other known rings that correspond to a particular year. Now, of course, I'm not doing it a bit of justice here. I'm not by any means a dendrochronologist, but I think you get the gist of it. Now, if the tree has gone through a particularly bad year, say a drought, then the ring will be much smaller or thinner than, say, a year in which the conditions were perfect for growth. Trees from the same environment and the same time will all show signs of these good years and bad years. It's all reflected in their rings, these seasonal stamps. And by comparing growth rings of various trees from a petrified forest, you can take a few trees and daisy chain them back to an earlier point in time, year by year. And in this way, a dendrochronologist can date, given decent samples, ancient wooden ships, tools, and the ancient hut that you found. But what if you want to go further? Let's say that behind this old wooden hut, you find something else. You find a skull. The skull appears to be human, but it's slightly different from any human skulls you've ever seen. Not that you're an expert, but you do know that something appears off. Maybe the skull is the owner of the hut. So you get out your phone and you call your sister, who just happens to be a paleontologist. Hey sis, so I found this old skull. Yeah, it's very old. You should come check it out. What your sister can do is attempt to date the skull using a method called radiocarbon dating. And this method was developed in the 1940s by American chemist Willard Libby. And what Libby's method looks at is the ratio of carbon-12 and carbon-14 present in the skull. But let's simplify this. All atoms decay, and research on this decay has revealed the rate of decay for different atoms. A copper atom will decay at a different rate than, say, a hydrogen atom. What we are concerned with is an isotope's half-life. The half-life is the length of time it will take for half of its atoms to decay. So let's look again at our skull. All living things, everything, contains carbon. We're carbon-based creatures after all, and it's a good bet that if you were to travel to another planet and it contained life, that life would also be carbon-based. It doesn't have to be, but that's the kind of life we're familiar with. Carbon has this incredible ability to stick together. It's how living things form into shapes. And the carbon within us decays. While we are alive, we take in new batches of carbon all the time. All living things do, and at the same ratio. These batches of carbon contain both carbon-12 and carbon-14. The only difference between the two being the number of neutrons in each atom. Carbon-12 has 6 neutrons and carbon-14 has 8, and that's it. But there is another difference: their rate of decay. Carbon-14 likes to decay much faster than carbon-12. So when an animal or a plant dies, it stops taking in fresh batches of carbon, leaving what's there, what it took in before it died, to decay. Carbon-12 is stubborn in that it holds off the inevitable for as long as it can, but carbon-14 merrily goes the way of decay. And by measuring the ratio of the two, we can tell approximately how old the specimen is or when it stopped taking in new batches of carbon. The half-life of carbon-14 is roughly 6,000 years. By using this radioactive clock, we can go as far back as 60,000 years. That equates to 10 half-lives, each being 6,000 years. But we're not through yet. So that's carbon dating. But what about really old fossils? You and I both know that fossils have been found that science tells us date back millions or even billions of years. How are we able to determine this if carbon dating only gets us as far back as 60,000 years? Remember, all atoms decay. Some decay
extremely slow.
So slow, in fact, that it takes millions of years for them to decay. Potassium-40 is a perfect example. The half-life of potassium-40 is 1.26 billion years. And one more time about half-life. Half-life is the measure of time it takes for half of an isotope's atoms to decay. So, when potassium-40 atoms decay, they turn into argon-40. When a sample contains 50% argon, it's reached its half-life. And before you ask, potassium-40 is not found in living things or things that were once living. You won't be able to measure a fossil's ratio of potassium-40 to argon-40, but you can measure it in the rocks around it, specifically igneous rocks. Igneous rocks are formed by molten activity. When molten lava solidifies, we have an igneous rock. I live in New Hampshire, so the example that I like to use here is granite. We have an abundance of it here. It's called the granite state for a reason. When molten rock solidifies into granite, there is only potassium-40 present and no argon. When it solidifies, the clock is set to 0. And by measuring the amount of argon-40 present in a sample, we can tell its age based on the argon to potassium ratio. So, if you find a fossil surrounded by granite or some other form of igneous rock, you can forget about carbon dating the sample. You can go straight to the granite around it. American professor of biology Jerry Coyne explained this in an interview conducted by Steve Paikin for The Agenda.
You have rocks that contain minerals that have radioactive decay, so they decay over time. For example, there's a form of potassium that takes like 1 billion years to lose half of its substance and turn into a gas. So what you can do is measure in a rock that's sitting next to a fossil the relative ratio of these elements, and from that you can get a very accurate date of these things, good to, like several 100,000 years or 1 million years, which is pretty accurate in the fossil record. Radiometric dating was a revolution. Before that happened, we only knew the relative order in which things happened, but we didn't know the absolute time. Now with these methods, which were developed in the 40s and 50s, we can date things quite accurately. We know, for example, that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old, because that's the oldest rocks that we have.
So that's how it's done. I bet you didn't know we were surrounded by natural clocks. We are so used to the clocks on our phones, watches, and dashboards that we forget about those that are actually found in nature. Clocks that have been ticking for billions of years, just waiting for someone to come along and notice what they've been up to and the story that they have to tell. Thank you for listening to the show. You can help support the show and its continued existence by going to evolutiontalk.com/support. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback on today's show, please let me know by using the site's contact page or on Twitter, where you can find me at Rick Coast. And most of all, thank you for listening. And until next time, please take care of yourself.
Evolution Talk is a Rick Coast production.